When Germans cut his B-17 in half at 24,000, he kept shooting all the way down, 24,000 feet. The air is so thin it starves your lungs, and so cold it turns your breath into needles of ice. Inside the B-17 flying fortress, the crew is fighting for their lives against a swarm of Luftwaffe fighters. Then it happens. A direct hit from a 20mm cannon or a mid-air collision. The sound isn't a bang, it's a terrifying crack. In a heartbeat, the massive bomber is snapped in two like a dry twig. The nose and wings spiral away, but the tail with the gunner still inside is left behind. A lonely metal cage falling through the abyss. Most men would scream, most would pray. But as the tail section spins toward the earth at 150 miles per hour, the German pilots see something that defies logic. The twin .50 calibers in the tail are still flashing. He's falling to his death, but he's taking as many of them with him as he can. This is the story of the man who kept shooting all the way down. Part 1. The vulnerable steel. To understand why a man would keep shooting while falling to his death, you first have to understand where he lived. The tail turret of a B-17 flying fortress was not designed for comfort. It was a cramped, vibrating glass and metal bubble at the very end of a 74-foot fuselage. While the pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit with a view of the horizon, and the waist gunners had room to move, the tail gunner, affectionately and terrifyingly known as Tail End Charlie, was alone. He didn't sit, he knelt. For 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a time, he remained on his knees on a small padded cushion, peering through a thick slab of bullet-resistant glass. Behind him was a narrow door, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. If he had to pee, if he had to stretch, or if he had to escape a burning plane, that door was his only hope. But in the chaos of battle, that hope was often a lie. At 24,000 feet, the tail was the coldest place on Earth. The wind whipped through the gaps in the turret, and the temperature hovered at 50 degrees below zero. The gunner wore a heavy, sheepskin-lined flight suit and a primitive electric heating system that often failed, leaving him to battle frostbite while scanning for the Luftwaffe. His only companions were two M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. They sat on either side of his head, their heavy barrels vibrating the very bones of his skull every time they fired. Below his knees were the ammunition track's metal chutes carrying thousands of rounds of lead from the main fuselage into his turret. The tail gunner was the rear-view mirror of the war. He was the first to see the black puffs of flak exploding behind the formation, and the first to see the specks on the horizon that would soon turn into screaming folk wolves. But there was a dark irony to his position. The tail gunner was the most targeted man in the sky. German pilots were taught that the fastest way to kill a B-17 was to silence the tail. They would dive from the sun, their 20mm cannons aimed directly at that little glass bubble. Every tail gunner knew the math. They knew their position had the highest casualty rate of any crew member. They lived in a world where death didn't come from the front, but from the shadow. The psychological toll was immense. You were separated from your brothers in arms by 30 feet of darkness and the roar of the engines. You only heard their voices over the crackling intercom. You were the guardian of the blind spot, the man who stood between his friends and the wolves. As the formation crossed into German airspace on this fateful mission, the air was deceptively calm. The gunner, let's call him Sergeant Miller, checked his oxygen mask. He felt the familiar rhythmic thumping of the engines through his knees. He looked at his guns, his twin babies, and checked the ammunition belts. He didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, the metal floor beneath him would vanish. He didn't know that the rivets holding his world together were about to be tested by a force they were never meant to survive. He was just a 19-year-old on his knees, praying to a god of steel and cordite, watching the empty blue sky for a flash of silver that would change everything. The silence was about to be broken by a sound that no man should ever hear, the sound of a 10-ton bomber snapping like a bone. Part 2. The collision. The attack didn't come with a warning. It came with the sun. One moment, the sky was a vast silent cathedral of blue. The next, it was filled with the screaming roar of BMW 801 radial engines. A group of Focke-Wulf 190s, the Butcher Birds, had intercepted the formation. These weren't just any fighters. They were Sturmback, heavily armored versions designed for one job: to ram or blast the American bombers out of the sky at point-blank range. From his kneeling position, Miller saw the flashes. The 20mm cannons on the FW-190's wings looked like flickering strobe lights. "Bandits, 6 o'clock, they're coming in hot." Miller screamed into his throat mic. He squeezed the triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, kicking back against his shoulders, sending a stream of tracers into the path of the lead fighter. But the Germans were relentless. They weren't peeling away. They were closing the distance: 600 yards, 400 yards, 200 yards. The air was filled with the smell of cordite and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Then, the world turned inside out. A burst of 20mm shells slammed into the fuselage, right at Station 6, the vulnerable point just behind the waist gunner's windows, where the tail section was bolted to the main body. It wasn't just a hit. It was a surgical amputation performed with high explosives. At 24,000 feet, the B-17 was a pressurized vessel under immense stress. When the shells tore through the aluminum skin and the steel longerons, the structural integrity of the aircraft vanished. The sound was something Miller would never forget. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of 10,000 giant branches snapping at once. Crack shrieked. In a terrifying heartbeat, the physics of flight were replaced by the chaos of gravity. The main body of the B-17, the wings, the 4 engines, the cockpit, and 8 of his brothers pitched forward and surged away, dragged by the remaining thrust of the propellers. Miller watched through his glass bubble as the front of his world simply vanished. He was left in the tail. The separation was so violent that the control cables snapped like whipcord, lashing through the empty air. The oxygen lines were severed, the green gas hissing out into the void. The intercom went dead with a final static pop. The tail section, now a jagged 5-ton cone of metal, didn't just fall. It began to flat spin. Because it had lost its center of gravity and its connection to the wings, the tail became a leaf in a hurricane. It began to whirl horizontally, faster and faster, creating a brutal centrifugal force that pinned Miller against the floor of his turret. He was 24,000 feet up. He had no oxygen. He had no communication. He had no way to reach his parachute, which was stowed just outside the turret door in the section of the fuselage that was now flapping in the wind. Most men would have blacked out from the G-force or the sheer terror. But as the tail spun, Miller looked through his sights. The German fighters, seeing the bomber break apart, were circling the wreckage like vultures, closing in to finish off any survivors or just to watch the kill. Miller's world was spinning at 120 RPM. The horizon was a blur of blue and white. But through the chaos, he saw a gray shape of Focke-Wulf pulling up alongside his falling tomb, the pilot likely looking for a victory photo. Miller didn't think about his parachute. He didn't think about the 5-mile drop to the earth. He reached for the spade handles. His fingers, already numbing from the sudden -50-degree cold, found the triggers. "Not today," he whispered. And in the middle of a free fall that should have been his end, the tail gunner began to fight back. Part 3. The spinning cage. The tail section was no longer a piece of a plane. It was a 5-ton steel seed pod, fallen from the edge of space. Because it was severed at an angle, the wind rushing past at 200 miles per hour caught the jagged edges of the fuselage, spinning the tail like a top. Inside, Miller was experiencing a living nightmare: centrifugal force. The spin was so violent, nearly 120 rotations per minute, that the blood was being forced out of his brain and into his feet. His vision began to gray out, a tunnel of darkness closing in from the edges. In the world of aviation, this is the G-trap. He was being pinned against the floor of the turret by a weight 3 times his own. Every movement of his hand felt like lifting a lead bar. But there was a second, more silent killer, hypoxia. At 24,000 feet, there isn't enough oxygen to keep a candle burning, let alone a human heart beating. When the tail snapped, Miller's primary oxygen line was gone. He had a small emergency walk-around bottle, but the jolt of the separation had knocked it out of its bracket. It was rolling somewhere in the dark behind him, just inches out of reach. His lungs burned. His mind began to drift into a dangerous euphoric fog. This is how men die at high altitudes. They simply fall asleep. Stay awake, Miller. He screamed at himself, the sound muffled by his mask. Wake the hell up. He bit his lip until he tasted blood. The pain brought a flicker of clarity. He looked out through the grease-streaked glass. The world was a dizzying blur of strobe light flashes. Blue sky, brown earth, blue sky, brown earth. Then, a shape broke the rhythm. A Focke-Wulf 190, painted in the mottled gray of the Luftwaffe, drifted into his spinning field of vision. The German pilot had throttled back, dropping his flaps to match the descent of the falling wreckage. He was close no more than 50 yards away. Miller could see the pilot's head turning, looking with grim curiosity at the severed tail. To the German, Miller was already a ghost. No one survived a breakup like this. He was just watching a piece of debris fall to earth. But Miller's hands were still on the spade handles of his Brownings. The problem was the physics. How do you aim when you are spinning like a carousel? If he fired straight, the centrifugal force and the rotation would throw the bullets wide. He had to time the shot. He had to wait for the German to pass through his line of fire in the split second of every rotation. It was like trying to hit a moving target while being spun in a centrifuge. Miller watched the German. Wait. The Focke-Wulf passed his sights. Flash. He didn't fire. Wait. Flash. There he was again. Miller began to lead the shot. He didn't aim at the plane. He aimed at the void where the plane would be in the next tenth of a second. He squeezed the triggers. Thud, 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 thud. The .50 caliber tracers didn't fly in a straight line. From the ground, they would have looked like a glowing red spiral, a corkscrew of fire reaching out from a falling tomb. The German pilot never saw it coming. He was so focused on the wreckage that he didn't expect the corpse to bite back. The tracers slammed into the FW-190's wing root, tearing through the fuel lines and the magnesium skin. A gout of flame erupted from the German's engine. The pilot, panicked and shocked, jerked his stick, sending the fighter into a violent roll before he bailed out. Miller watched the parachute bloom above him. A grim smile touched his lips. He was falling to his death, but he had just won a dogfight while in free fall. But the victory was short-lived. The earth was rushing up to meet him. The brown patches of the German countryside were no longer tiny squares. They were becoming forests and fields. He was below 15,000 feet now. The air was thicker, but the spin was getting faster as the atmosphere pushed against the tail's jagged metal. He was alone, spinning, and about to hit the planet at terminal velocity. And that's when Miller realized the most terrifying thing of all. He didn't want to die in a cage. He had to get out. But how do you escape a spinning room when gravity has pinned you to the floor? Part 4. Pure Defiance. As the tail section plummeted past 10,000 feet, a miracle happened. Oxygen. The air became thick enough for Miller's brain to snap back into focus. The euphoric fog of hypoxia evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard adrenaline of a man who realizes he has exactly 60 seconds to live. He fought against the G-force, his muscles screaming as he tried to pull himself toward the small door at the back of the turret. But the centrifugal force was a physical wall. Every time he tried to reach for the latch, the spin threw his arm back against the glass. Finally, with a roar of pure frustration, he used his entire body weight to lunge toward the fuselage section. He reached the spot where his parachute should have been. It was gone. The separation had been so violent that the parachute pack, stowed in its rack just inches outside the armored turret, had been sucked into the void or shredded by the snapping cables. Miller looked out at the jagged metal edge where his world had been cut in half. There was nothing but the screaming wind and the brown earth of Germany rushing up at 150 miles per hour. He was trapped. He was going to hit the ground inside a metal box. Most people believe that falling from that height is a quick death, but for Miller, time had slowed down. He realized that the tail section wasn't just falling, it was auto-rotating. Because of its cone-like shape and the way the elevators were jammed, the tail was acting like a primitive, chaotic parachute. It was creating drag, fighting against gravity. The math of his survival was a razor's edge. The terminal velocity VT of a human is about 120 miles per hour. Inside the tail, with the drag created by the jagged aluminum skin, he was falling at maybe 90 to 100 miles per hour. It was still a death sentence. But it was a death sentence with a chance. Instead of curling into a ball and waiting for the end, Miller crawled back to his guns. If he was going to die, he would die as a soldier. He looked through the sights one last time. Below him, he saw a German convoy on a road, tiny as ants. He saw a village with a church steeple. And then, he saw them. 2 more Messerschmitts, circling the falling debris like sharks. They weren't shooting. They were mocking him, flying close to watch the final impact. "You want to see a show?" Miller spat, his hands gripping the handles. Even as the ground became close enough to see individual trees, even as the air pressure popped his eardrums, Miller kept his eyes on the lead fighter. He didn't have enough breath left to scream, but he had enough strength to squeeze. The Brownings barked their final defiance. The tracers arced through the air, a dying man's signature written in fire across the German sky. He wasn't even trying to kill them anymore. He was simply announcing to the world that he was still there. He was still fighting. The German pilots flicked their wings in a strange, involuntary sign of respect and pulled away. They knew they were watching something they would never see again. A man who refused to surrender to the very laws of physics. 1,000 feet. The roar of the wind was a deafening scream. 500 feet. Miller curled his body away from the guns, bracing himself against the padded floor of the turret. He tucked his chin into his chest, wrapped his arms around his head, and closed his eyes. He thought of his mother. He thought of the girl back in Iowa. He thought of the smell of fresh cut hay. "Please," he whispered. The tail section slammed into a forest canopy. The sound was like 1,000 glass bottles shattering at once. Branches snapped like toothpicks, stripping the metal skin from the fuselage, slowing the descent for a fraction of a second before the final bone-crushing impact with the frozen earth. Part 5. The Miracle or the Legend. The silence in the German forest was absolute. The snow fell softly, covering the twisted, jagged remains of what used to be a B-17's tail. Steam rose from the mangled metal, and the smell of burnt oil and cordite hung heavy in the freezing air. A patrol of German Wehrmacht soldiers approached the wreckage with their rifles raised. They had seen the mid-air breakup from the ground. They had seen the tail spinning down like a lost soul. They expected to find a tomb, a mangled collection of bones and silver-painted aluminum. But as they drew closer, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. The barrels of the twin .50 caliber machine guns were still pointing toward the sky. They were still smoking. And from inside the crushed glass bubble, they heard a sound that should have been impossible. A cough, a ragged, bloody, defiant cough. When the German soldiers tore open the crumpled access door, they found Sergeant Miller. He was broken. His legs were shattered, his ribs were crushed, and his face was a mask of blood and oil. But his hands, those frozen, numb hands, were still wrapped around the spade handles of his guns. The Germans, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front who had seen everything, stood there in a circle of stunned silence. One of the soldiers, an older sergeant, reached down and gently pried Miller's fingers from the triggers. He looked at the guns, then at the boy, and whispered in German, "Du bist ein Geist." How did he survive? Later, military investigators and physicists would call it a statistical anomaly. But it wasn't just luck. It was a perfect storm of physics and engineering.